مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. خلال أول شهر له في منصبه ركز الرئيس بايدن على ما يستطيع فعله بمفرده: الإدلاء بتصريحات واقتراح مرشحين وإصدار أوامر تنفيذية. كثير من هذه القرارات كانت رمزية، بل وكانت بعضها مهمة، ولكن العمل الحقيقي يبدأ الآن. تشريع التغيير لتغيير المسار من مسار إدارة ترامب ولتغيير حياة ملايين الأمريكيين. نحن نعرف ما هي أهم أولويات للرئيس: قانون الإنفاق قرابة 2 تريليون دولار لتحفيز الاقتصاد وإعادة الناس إلى العمل ودعم الأسر ذات الأطفال ومساعدة الولايات والحكومات المحلية في الاستجابة للجائحة. بغض النظر عن الجمهوريين، لدى الرئيس مهمة صعبة للاحتفاظ بدعم كل ديمقراطي في مجلس الشيوخ، وهو ما سيحتاج إليه لينال الموافقة. وبعدها ماذا يأتي تاليا؟ إصلاح الهجرة، التواصل في رعاية الصحية، زيادة الضرائب على المواطنين الإثرياء. لا يمكن أن يفعل بايدن كل شيء، لا بد له من الاختيار، وهو اختيار سيكون واحدا من أهم قرارات رئاسته. كما يقول جورج واشنطن لألكسندر هامilton في المسرحية الموسيقية التي تحمل ذات الاسم: الفوز كان سهلا أيها الشاب، ممارسة الحكم أصعب. لمناقشة الأولويات التشريعية للرئيس بايدن يسمح أن نرحب بالصحفيين السياسيين المتميزين ديفيد دراكر وميني راكر. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Today, I'm delighted to welcome David Drucker and Minnie Racker to help explain for us what has actually gone on over the last month and what the coming months might portend for important decisions by our new president. It seems, Minnie, that there's a group of at least a half a dozen Republicans, similar to the group that voted for the conviction of Donald Trump, that want to give the president the benefit of the doubt and that are voting more or less consistently, even for all of Joe Biden's nominees. Is that a block that Joe Biden can count on for to support some of his other legislative initiatives down the road?
You know, I think there's always party dynamics that will come into play, so you should never count on anything in Washington. But I think Biden has worked really hard to court senators. He's a creature of the Senate. He's really worked on creating a friendly environment, having White House meetings with some of these senators. For instance, he had an infrastructure meeting last week that involved members of both parties, and afterwards he's continued to be in communication through phone calls and letters with Senator Susan Collins, who's kind of one of those Republicans who might be open to working with him. So, you know, I think Biden is really making an effort to reach out to that bloc, and while it might be hard to maintain, he's got a shot.
All right. Before we get to the stimulus discussion, I did want to just take a moment to say a word about all the executive orders. There was a huge flurry of these in the first week, mostly to undo things that Donald Trump had issued his own executive orders about. But Minnie, when you look at these, is there any surprises that emerged in these executive orders from your view? Anything that stood out as out of the ordinary?
Well, so you look at the executive orders Biden has issued, and he has, I believe, issued more executive action significantly in his first month than recent presidents. And his argument for that is he had to undo some of the what he calls bad policy that President Trump had enacted. So I think what's a little surprising to me is just the sheer amount of these actions that he has taken that target what President Trump did and that work to reverse those things. And this is as the administration, refuses to say Trump's name, basically, and is really focused on not making this presidency about Trump. When you look at Biden's actions, the things he's actually doing, they are so heavily about undoing the previous administration.
And David, when you look at the whole gamut of executive orders, does anything stand out for something that he did do that surprised you, or perhaps an order that he didn't make that you expected?
Well, what I was most struck by in recent days is that President Biden said in a town hall setting that was televised in the United States directly to a voter that wants him to take executive action to absolve Americans of their student loan debt, that he couldn't do it. And often we don't see that sort of blunt talk directly to a voter when you're telling them what they can't get or what they're not going to do. So while it's very true, and I think it's important to note the fact that the executive presidency is like a runaway train, and every president that comes along in recent years seems to overstep the bounds or expand the bounds of executive authority, being that the United States Congress has no interest in stopping them from doing it. It isn't out of line with what now President Biden said he would do when he was running for president. And there has not been an uproar. Republicans have made note of the fact that he's possibly overstepping his bounds or doing things that aren't good for the country. But Democrats are happy. Rank and file voters are barely paying attention. And so I don't think this is an issue for Biden, although we pay attention to it here in Washington, unless he decides to really overstep the Constitution on an area or a subject in which Americans disagree with him.
Just take 20 seconds, David, and explain why you think that Congress has no interest in restricting these executive orders. One would think that Congress will be quite jealous to maintain its own prerogative.
Yeah, that's what the framers of our Constitution were counting on, that whatever partisan differences politicians in the United States Congress would have with each other, they would so be jealous of their congressional authority that they would not allow the president, regardless of political party, to overstep. But over the years, in the modern era of the late 20th century and early 21st century, our Congress has begun to operate more like a parliamentary system, more like a parliament, in which if my president's in office, then I'm going to let him do whatever he wants. But if your president's in office, I'm going to complain about it and say he shouldn't do it. And this goes back and forth. When President Trump was in office, Republicans didn't complain about his executive orders. Now that President Biden's in office, Democrats are not complaining about his executive orders. And neither party seems to care that the presidents Biden, Trump, Obama, Bush, and so on down the line keep usurping their authority. As long as they like the president that's usurping their authority and they like how the reasons why they're usurping their authority, they're just fine with it. And I think part of it is that they don't want to take political risks to actually get together and say, we may agree with this or disagree with it, but it's not your prerogative, it's ours, and we're not going to let you do it. Maybe things will swing back in the other direction at some point, but right now we're in an era of the super executive.
So, David, childcare, minimum wage, this is a pretty broad spectrum of issues that are being brought under the rubric of coronavirus stimulus package.
Right. Well, President Biden has presented this as his program for helping the economy recover from the coronavirus and for helping people create a financial bridge from where we are in the pandemic today to getting to the other side of the coronavirus pandemic. And if you've noticed, there has not been a lot of Republican opposition in terms of what they focus their political messaging on. I mean, you won't get a lot of Republican votes for it. They complain about different parts of it, but they're really not focused on defeating it the way they're focused on energy issues and environmental issues that they oppose that are coming from the Obama administration.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to continue the discussion about what comes the day after the passage of the Biden stimulus program with David Drucker and Minnie Rocker in just a moment. There is a lot of talk in our politics about the progressives, the leftist activist wing of the Democratic Party. pushing for such initiatives as the Green New Deal, a $15 minimum wage, and single-payer national health insurance, like the kind they have in Canada and much of Europe. But this is not the first time the term progressive has entered our national lexicon. About 125 years ago, America was at the dawn of what was known as the Progressive Era, about 20 years of widespread social activism and political reform. Progressive reformers were typically middle-class society, especially women or Christian ministers, focused on the problems caused by industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and political corruption. The three presidents of the Progressive Era were Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, all committed to various types of reform, from government supervision of food and drugs to extending the vote to women. The most forgettable of their reforms was prohibition, the ban on the sale of alcohol. They achieved much, but left much still to be done. What will today's progressives learn from them? In many ways, now is their moment. We will soon learn that answer. Again, our panelists today include David Drucker. David is the senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner. Previously, he served as senior editor of CQ Roll Call, an insider newspaper covering Capitol Hill, and as political reporter for the Los Angeles Daily News, covering California politics. Also joining us is Minnie Racker. Minnie is a staff correspondent at the National Journal, where she covers the intersection of politics and culture, as well as the progressive movement. A graduate of Stanford University, she interned previously at the Los Angeles Times in Sacramento, the state capital of California. All right, let's move on to what would be the next big question. As president, you only get a few shots at doing big initiatives. And so after stimulus, President Biden needs to make a choice. What comes next? Is it immigration? Is it expanding health? Is it infrastructure? Is it something else? What do you think? And how does that decision actually get made? Minnie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the administration has been pretty tight-lipped on this, but we have a few hints about what's going to happen going forward. So I think one priority will be immigration. And I think that because we're going to see Congress and the White House release their big immigration bill this week. And again, in Biden's recent town hall, where the focus was mostly coronavirus, we did see immigration come up. We did see Biden say that his priority is kind of undoing, again, some of those actions that Trump took on this and taking on the responsibility, he says, as a country we have for, aiding refugees, for creating a path to citizenship. So it seems to me like that'll be one of the very next things that he works on.
I mean, immigration is a tough one to achieve. We've seen this before, David. Do you think that the administration is going to try to finally break through the Gordian knot on immigration and get a major bill passed?
Right. Well, what we will see, the Republicans and Democrats in some form or another have been trying to deal with immigration reform off and on for the last 15 to 20 years. And the last time there was a major push for it, the last two times. One time was under George W. Bush, and Republican voters were so angry with him for the policy he devised that they were sending pesos, the Mexican currency, into his political committee to voice their displeasure. Under President Obama, there was a bipartisan push in the Senate to try and reform immigration. It was dead on arrival in the House of Representatives. I do think, though, that for Biden's voting coalition, the Hispanic voters that are a part of his coalition and liberal activists have watched as immigration generally has played second fiddle to other topics over the past decade or so. And I think that they're impatient. So I agree with many, I expect Biden's next big thing to be immigration reform. Whether it can pass is a whole nother story because so many competing political cross currents. There's the push to legalize illegal immigrants in the United States. Republicans always oppose that. There's the push for more border security. As you can see, President Biden is halting construction of the border wall along the Mexican border that was started by President Trump. So this thing is a mess before it started. Maybe President Biden can thread the needle. What he would be smart to do is, in addition to the immigration push, would be to focus on something else that could be unifying. And infrastructure, if somebody would finally take it up, could be unifying, in part because the economy is still going to be languishing because of the coronavirus, and because nobody in America really cares about the debt. So if you want to propose spending yet another $1.5 trillion to 2 to 3 trillion, this time on infrastructure, whether it's the right or wrong thing to do, voters certainly aren't going to complain.
And Minnie, just to put the sort of political hue on this, when you look at Republicans and as they begin to approach the 2022 election, can't believe we're already talking about this, but is it generally better to be seen as cooperative and problem solving and getting things to your constituents, that even if they're presidentially led initiatives, or is it better to be seen as standing up for, whatever principles one might have and saying no? Which is politically, more effective?
Well, it definitely depends who you are and where you are. So if you are Susan Collins, like I said, who's in a kind of swing state, has won these difficult campaigns, it helps to show that you're open to working with the other side. And senators and congresspeople, they love to talk about bipartisanship. So that can be beneficial for some folks. But at the same time, like, the reason that we see, some Republicans push back on everything Biden does is because it is beneficial for some of them in the reddest states. That's what's going to endear them to their base and to their voters. You see some members of Congress vote to impeach President Trump, and you see their state parties censuring them. You see people talk about these members of Congress and say, we didn't send them to Congress to do the right thing or to act on their beliefs, So it really depends where you are.
And David, if you are Mitch McConnell or Kevin McCarthy, what's your view of this issue?
Well, you're leading the opposition to immigration reform if you are the party leaders, because in so many of these districts across the country, and in many of these states that are not swing states, there's just going to be a lot of opposition to President Biden's immigration reform. I mean, heck, Republicans could barely get enough support for changes to immigration with President Trump, who many thought, might be like Richard Nixon going to China in the 1970s. If there's anybody you could trust to fix immigration, and you're a conservative or you're an immigration hawk, it would be President Trump, who campaigned on building a wall and tightening the screws on illegal border crossers. So if Republicans couldn't do it with Trump in office, I don't think you're going to see them cooperate with Biden in office, on top of which the former president, Donald Trump, plans to be very active politically. And I can only imagine a scenario in which McConnell and McCarthy decide to cooperate with Biden. Trump will be out there in 5 seconds, quickly saying that these party leaders are wrong and they should be deposed and you shouldn't listen to them. Republican primary voters would be up in arms. Republicans would be looking over their shoulder in primaries, where they nominate Republicans every year before the general election. So don't expect too much cooperation. But Minnie's right. For those, for those dozen or so in the House, and and maybe handful or so in the Senate, maybe a few of them that come from states that are interested in immigration reform, that are not rock-ribbed Republican states or districts, you could see some cooperation. And then it's going to be on Democrats to be able to hold their entire caucuses in the House and Senate so that they have the votes. One caveat here: in the Senate, of course, it takes 60 votes to pass legislation. And if Democrats and Republicans can't produce 60 votes in the Senate, the whole thing's going to die.
Fascinating. Well, thank you very much, David and Minnie, for helping to explain all this to our viewers abroad, complicated though it may be. Thank you very much for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. I have been very fortunate. My kids and I have avoided the coronavirus now for 10 months. I've kept my job throughout the recession, and life has gone on. Certainly with changes and limitations, but we have not felt the terrible sacrifice or tragedy that has befallen so many millions of Americans and people around the world. Then, a couple of weeks ago, my mother died. She had not been well for many years, and at 92, her death was sad, but not tragic. Still, the passing of a parent at any age is hard, especially when my mother's death happened on my birthday. For the first time since the pandemic began, I got a glimpse of the terrible sadness so many people are feeling. My mother has been living in a nursing home for years. I haven't seen her since March, when the facility was closed to all family members. My mom contracted COVID just around the new year, less than a week before she was scheduled to be vaccinated. The nurses and attendants at her nursing facility are kind, considerate people who took excellent care of her for years. But as is common in these facilities across the country, only about half of the staff chose to take the vaccine. The sad result was not difficult to predict. Then came the funeral, another sad affair. Regulations limited attendance to a bare handful. Because my mother had COVID, we weren't allowed to approach the casket until it was lowered to the ground. Fears of contagion meant we weren't even allowed to use a shovel to participate in the symbolic burying of our loved one. In frigid New England weather, we used our bare hands to throw dirt into the grave. We dispersed almost as quickly as when we gathered. After the brief graveside service, there was no place for us to go. I don't tell my mother's story in search of some special sympathy. Rather, I tell it because it is now so ordinary. It is the story of more than 400,000 American families, a disproportionate number of them burying their elderly mothers and fathers, uncles and aunts, grandmothers and grandfathers. There has been enormous heroism during the pandemic, ordinary people doing extraordinary things on behalf of others, usually people they never knew. They deserve our thanks, our praise, and our support. The other side of the story are the huge number of ordinary people whose lives were cut short, some by weeks, some by years, some by decades, by this voracious virus and the cruel way the virus even deprives us of the customs and rituals by which we mourn. Insulated from the worst of the virus, I never had a chance to come face to face to thank the ordinary heroes, but I have seen what the virus can do, not just to its victims, but to the community around them. And I can only hope it is at least another century before something as terrible as this strikes again. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول أكبر مشروع قانون إنفاق في تاريخ الأمريكي، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.